Morning, everyone. So today I'm going to discuss about an overview of the Philippine short story in English. Just a little warning, you will probably hear a lot of noise in the background, and that is because it is very early in the morning. So any account of the development of the Philippine short story in English has to begin, excuse me, with the fact that it is in English. In short, Philippine literature in English is tied up with the experience of colonialism, an essential truth that all serious Filipino writers in English must address at some point in their careers. National Artist for Literature Francisco Arceliana, describing the period of emergence of literature in English, wrote, "There is something uncommon in the not inviolable situation of the Filipino writer in English, and this is the insuperable problem of language. The life from which he draws substance is lived in a language different from the language he uses. He is therefore twice removed, by the language and by the work of art." The Hispanic period, 1565 to 1897. In his pioneering study of the novel in the Philippines, Origins and Rise of the Filipino Novel, Rizal Mojares has demonstrated that fiction in the Philippines has its roots deep in native soil. There is a tradition of local narratives, oral epics, ballads, tales, to which were later added other narrative types introduced by the Spaniards, including the metrical romances and lives of saints. Fiction in the Philippines developed by combining elements from these different traditions. So Spain's intrusion resulted in the decline of the oral folk epics. The Catholic religious orders monopolized printing presses. Thus, early written literature was entirely religious in content. The Spaniards also introduced the metrical romance, which locally became the awit and the corrido, along with the Passion, the life of Christ sung or chanted like a folk epic as part of Lenten rituals, whose plots were transmitted or dramatized in the carrillo, which is a shadowgraph, and the comedia or mora moro. The metrical romances became an integral part of the local imagination. Prose, chiefly lives of saints and monologues of conduct, dates from the 19th century. The high point in the intellectual history of this period was the propaganda movement, which happened in 1862 to 1896, to which belonged many of the men who were later to become the heroes of the Philippine Revolution. Ironically, most of this writing was in Spanish, and the essay was the preferred form. Influenced by the modern spirit of scientific inquiry, writers turned away from the Romanticism and focused on empirical experience, historical realities, and political problems. Jose Rizal's celebrated novels, No Limitang Hero and El Filibusterismo, both written in Spanish, are the first examples of realist fiction produced by a Filipino, and are clearly the work of a man steeped in both his native traditional literature as well as European literatures in several languages. As the 19th century drew to a close and it became obvious that the Spain-based propaganda movement's campaign for reforms would not succeed, Filipino intellectuals turned to the radical revolutionary movement at home, the Katipunan, and to the Tagalog language. The Philippine Revolution had a brief moment of triumph with the proclamation of independence by General Emilio Aguinaldo. But Spain ceded the Philippines to the US in the Treaty of Paris in 1898, and the Americans entered Manila in the guise of liberators to stay as conquerors. After the Philippine American War, which happened in 1899 to 1902, our people had to take willy nilly to an American public school system in which English became the medium of instruction. The American period, 1898 to 1945. The University of the Philippines was founded by the American colonizers in 1908 to educate young Filipinos to become the new English speaking intelligentsia. It was with this new elite who came from a broader sector of society than the 19th century illustrados that Philippine writing in English had its beginnings. The novel in Tagalog had flourished during the last part of the 19th century. Spanish was on the decline and English had not yet been fully established. In terms of narrative technique, the Tagalog sentimental novels, descendants of the romances of the earlier centuries, are a regression from the standards set by Rizal. Most novelists did not have Rizal's education or exposure to European literature, and most of their work was written for serialization in popular periodicals. hence the split between high and low literature and the evolution of the concept of the Bakya crowd as opposed to the cultural elite. This cultural alienation was to have far-reaching effects. As Mohari says, the vernacular literatures dropped down the cultural scale and almost away from the view of the new urban-oriented university-educated generation. So there seems to be a general agreement among critics that it was in the field of the short story that Filipino writers in English excelled. Many have remarked that on the speed with which Filipinos took to the genre, which was born only around 15 years before the outbreak of the Pacific War. Writing in 1941, literary scholar Leopoldo Yabis referred to its remarkable, almost phenomenal growth. The maiden issue of the University of the Philippines' first literary journal, the College Folio, with three short stories, contained contributions that Yabis dismissed as tales of love about legendary persons, adding that they ignored the actual Philippine scene or perhaps were not yet aware of the rich material it could offer. In his opinion, the early short story writer in English, because he had no local tradition to follow, drew upon Western patterns, but perhaps, while he was indeed drawing from Western models for the form and technique of the short story, the Filipino fictionist was relying on the native narrative traditions for his subject matter, which would explain the choice by the remote past as material for his tales. By the 1920s, English was firmly established both as a medium of education and literary expression. Magazines like Philippine Magazine and the Philippine Free Press, and the organizations like the UP Writers Club, which was founded in 1927 and still in existence today, attracted the most gifted literary men and women. These developments reinforced what Moharis called the fragmentation of the audience, hampering the technical development of writing in the native languages and alienating the writers in English from the popular culture. By 1933, Garcia Villa's collection of stories, Footnote to Youth, had earned from the American critic Edmund O'Brien the comment that Villa was among the half dozen short story writers in America who count. Villa also undertook an annual collection of what he considered the best Filipino short stories in English, a project he was to sustain until 1940. The project played an important role in determining the way in which the short story in English was to develop. As Arceliana put it, more than any other single activity of the decade, this yearly chore of Villa shaped the Filipino short story in English of the 1930s, helped define it, and gave it direction. From the very beginning, Filipino fictionists in English were aware of the need to sound different from their American and British models. Argila's work is often cited for having most effectively used English to express a thoroughly Filipino experience and sensibility. The editor-publisher of the Philippine magazine, A.B.H. Hartendorf, said that Argila used English as if it were a Philippine dialect, so adequately does he find it for his purpose. Yabis himself regarded Argila as perhaps the only really authentic voice. And Arceliana was to write 2 decades later, I don't believe that more beautiful writing has ever been achieved by any other Filipino. It is writing so lucid and luminous, that is so clear and so radiant. His language is English, and yet it is Filipino. So during the period immediately before the World War II, a period of unrest in the Philippine countryside, Filipino writers in English came under the influence of American proletarian literature. The literary dictator Garcia Villa, who espoused the poetics of arts for art's sake, was now challenged by younger writers who had found an alternative critical framework, socially committed literature in Salvador P. Lopez's collection of essays, Literature and Society. When Nick Joaquin published the story Three Generations in 1940 in the Herald Midweek magazine, it was obvious that a new era had begun for Filipino writing in English. Joaquin's dazzling use of the English language and mastery of narrative technique was to eclipse anything achieved by his contemporaries. The post-war period, 1946 to 1960. A few years before the outbreak of the war in the Pacific, the government established the Commonwealth Literary Awards, which gave literature a tremendous boost, but the elation was short-lived. In 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and shortly after invaded the Philippines. The Japanese made Nippongo compulsory in Philippine schools and forbade the use of English. Only the Tagalog literary magazine Nuwayway was allowed to continue publishing. 5 years later, with the country in ruins, the US decided to grant the promised independence and the Philippines became a republic. However, the American influence on Philippine culture remains strong, not only because several treaties ensured economic ties with the former colonial power, but because of a cultural program popularly known as the Fulbright program, which granted scholarships, fellowships, etc., and brought practically every important artist and scholar to the US. The two-volume sequel to Yabis' first anthology was published in 1981. In his critical introduction, Yabis noted some new developments: the greater frankness with which sex was beginning to be handled, the inclusion of ethnic and cultural minorities as subject matter, and the increase in the number of stories set in foreign lands. Another new trend was the deviation from the conventional realist mode, as in Francisco Solano's stories and in Nick Joaquin's tales, which seemed to anticipate marvelous realism before the Latin Americans were being taught in Philippine classrooms, like the legends of a dying wanton. Among the new writers included in the second Yabis anthology were some who were to gain prominence in the succeeding decades. An important development in the literary scene at this time was the establishment of a short story writing contest by the Philippine Free Press magazine in 1949 and of the Carlos Palanca Memorial Literary Awards in 1950. These awards, still ongoing today, are undoubtedly a source of both encouragement and honor for writers. The contemporary period, 1960 to 2005. In 1960, the government instituted the Republic Cultural Heritage Awards to initiate a movement for greater and more dedicated efforts in cultural advancement to complement the country's program of economic development, and the first recipient was NVM Gonzalez for the novel The Bamboo Dancers. This was a forerunner of the present National Artist Awards. Two anthologies published in the early 60s give us a good idea of the scene a decade after Agcaule's book. In his introduction to the Pen Anthology of Short Stories in 1962, editor Arceliana noted that it was the consensus that the Filipino short stories in English is the most impressive in achievement. In explaining his choices, he cited People in the War by Gilda Cordero Fernando as the finest Filipino short story to come out of the war. Tomorrow is a Downhill Place by Erwin Castillo as one of several stories by young hands which show the young Filipino short story writer's preoccupation with Filipino history. In The Smithy of My Soul by Cesar Aquino as a fine example of the new wave in Filipino fiction, and the other stories as the best examples of the work of their authors. This last story, an extravagant lyrical, rather dense reflection or meditation, might strike the reader today as rather self-indulgent. So would Wilfrida Sanchez, Moon Under My Feet, and Rice Wine by Wilfrida Noledo. Perhaps the one quality that the younger writers in this anthology had in common is their impressionistic, self-conscious, and manipulation of language. Equinox One, an anthology of new writing from the Philippines, edited and published 3 years later by F. Sionil Jose, included more new names like Jose V. Ayala, G. Burrs Bunao, Lilia Pablo Amansik, and Norma Miraflor. In his introduction, Andres Cristobal Cruz pointed out that these writers are pervasively subjective and attributed this to the fact that they were writing in a borrowed language. Commitment seems to be at art first and to life second, according to Cruz. The debate between Villa and Lopez had obviously not been settled and would continue to rage. The problem of a lack of audience for Philippine writing in English was also becoming increasingly obvious. In modern Philippine short stories, the American critic Leonard Casper commented that to write honestly about his people, the Filipino writer in English apparently must risk not writing for them. At the same time, as Gonzalez noted ironically, he was indeed gaining some recognition elsewhere. He cited Donald Keen's response to the Casper anthology. Whatever course Philippine literature may take, we are certainly fortunate that there are now Filipinos who can speak to us beautifully in our own language without risking the terrible hazards of translation. The collection as a whole is of even more importance than the individual excellences. It is an admirable testimony to the emergence of another important branch of English literature. This was also a period of maturity for many of the older writers, like Nick Joaquin, Kerry Mapulutan, Bin Vinedo Santos, F. Junelose, and Linda Tai Casper, who were now producing novels. So during the 1960s, The quality of the stories published in the Philippine Free Press and the Graphic magazine reached new heights. The former, in particular, had a powerhouse staff consisting of some of the most gifted writers in English. Joaquin Pulutan Brillantes Nuledo and Jose Lacaba Jr., and published stories by both major and emerging writers. And in 1969, the Graphic, which had the brilliant young Ninochka Rosca for literary editor, established its own literary awards. NVM Gonzalez thought it was encouraging that universities were beginning to offer graduate courses in Philippine literature and that writers were beginning to define recognition as more than just being published abroad. On the other hand, he echoed Edelberto Tiempo in deploring the failure of criticism in the country. According to him, the inability of Philippine criticism to establish its own premises. At about the same time, Joseph Galdon, in his Introduction to Philippine Fiction, a collection of critical essays for the Journal of Philippine Studies, identified the recurring themes in Philippine fiction in English as the search for identity, both personal and cultural, the struggle to distinguish between illusion and reality, and alienation or the failure to communicate. In the late 60s, the country entered a period of political turbulence. Student power had erupted in campuses all over the world, partly fueled by widespread protest against the Vietnam War, and Filipino students were rallying to a radical nationalist movement which sought to end the stranglehold of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism and Philippine society. This unrest was to culminate in the declaration of martial law by President Ferdinand Marcos in 1972. The effect of this political unrest in literature was to politicize writers, taking their cue from Mao Zedong's talks at the Yan'an Forum, from Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of the writer as engaged, and from the works of the Filipino historian Renato Constantino. Many of them shed the subjective precious mannered style of the earlier decade and the predilection of for purely personal concerns like the search for identity or romantic love or the preoccupation with the absurdity of life. These were now considered decadent and reactionary. Some writers even gave up writing in English altogether. On the whole, it was a period of intellectual ferment. The Marcos dictatorship, which ended in 1986, was a long, dry period for literature. The media came under tight control. Literary publishing was nipped in the bud, and nonetheless, some writers continued to publish. The Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards for Literature were awarded each year, and in 1973, the Marcos government issued Proclamation Number 1144, providing special awards in recognition of artistic and literary accomplishment at its highest level and to elevate creative expression in all its forms to its rightful status as the vanguard of the country's spiritual development. Jose Garcia Villa was the first national artist for literature. Focus Philippines, a magazine owned by Juan Tovera and Karima Pulutan, widely known to be Marcos Cronies, began publication in 1972 and continued publishing fiction throughout the martial law period. It also offered literary awards, but most writers took a while to be reconciled to the Marcos regime, and some resisted till the end. As Richard Krogan observed, this magazine has to become one of the main outlets for new writers. But so far, the results have not been impressive. Many modern writers are choosing topics from an earlier period and subjects that are trivial. They are escaping from both the present and the future. In general, the writers seem afraid to truly express themselves. There is an absence of new creative artists. Krogan's book contains many texts never before included in anthologies, among them the stories of Ricardo Patalinhog, Luis V. Teodoro Jr., and Amadis Maria Guerrero. Krogan also took note of a national seminar on bilingual education at the Ateneo de Manila University in 1974, during which a consensus emerged that Filipino would increasingly become the medium of instruction in Philippine schools. This means that the quality of English will change. Perhaps in future years, the writers will use a language that is really Inglipino or Filipinish. It appears that the future of Philippine literature in English is uncertain. His conclusion is interesting. Whatever the future may bring in this modern period of Philippine literature in English, the literary style and content have become more Filipino than ever before. Philippine literature had been well served by resistance to Marcos. Oppression had forced Filipino writers to take a hard look, not just at the dictator, but at their own role as a writer and to confront not just their attitude toward the dictator, but their beliefs regarding their role as writers in a society like Marcos' so-called new society. The assassination in 1983 of the opposition leader Benigno Aquino set in motion a tide of indignation that finally brought Marcos down in what has come to be known as people power. With the restoration of democracy under President Corazon Aquino, literature enjoyed an unprecedented flowering. New magazines and newspapers were set up, and new publishing houses welcomed manuscripts from both established and new writers. One of the most striking things about literary scene today is that despite the fact that the audience for literature has not grown much, 1,000 is the average print run for a short story collection, and despite the fact that writers still cannot expect to earn their living solely by writing fiction or poetry, the tribe appears to be increasing rather than diminishing. This includes writers in English, which as a language has lost considerable ground, the level of English language proficiency in the country having steadily deteriorated. So this is in the present scene. So where the short story is concerned, we might note that some of the old guard are still writing. F. Sunil Jose and Linda Tay Casper are as prolific as ever. Ida Rivera Ford published a collection of old and new stories in 1998. Among the new writers in their 60s, Renato Madrid, Jaime Ann Lim, Joy Dairit, Antonio Enriquez, Alfred Yuzon, Susan Lara, and Cristina Pantoa Hidalgo continue to publish fiction. There are also writers in their 50s and 40s who came to fiction later than their contemporaries and are just hitting their stride, like Jimeno Echabad, Carlos Aurios, Antonio Hidalgo, and Carlos Cortez. Other writers in their 40s and 50s, like Jose Y. Dalisay Jr. and Charleston Ong, are at the peak of their powers. And then there is a whole slew of writers in their 30s and even in their 20s who have burst into the scene and are lighting it up. A few of them have already published individual collections and regularly win prizes for their work. This youngest generation of fictionists is producing stories which range in style from the conventional well-made stories of Romina Gonzalez to the postmodernism of Maria Elena Paterno, from the social realism of Mencho Sarmiento to the gothic lyricism of Clinton Palanca, from the quiet little initiation stories of Sayan Abad Hugo to the raw violence of Mariby Sullivan Blanco, from the sexual explicitness of Lara Sagisag to the cerebral games played by Luis Katibak, and from the minimalist pieces of Tara F.T. Searing to the complex meditations of Vicente Groyon III. These writers recognize no taboos, writing with ease about incest, prostitution, child abuse, abortion, euthanasia, ethnicity, gender, globalization, but also, of course, about the old subjects love, death, courage, betrayal, guilt, forgiveness, expiation. Their works bear the effects not only of a wide range of influences, but also of MTV, the internet, international cinema, sci fi, anime, etc. Academe has been involved in literature since the establishment of the University of the Philippines early in the 20th century. But the formalization of this connection through creative writing programs, workshops, centers, etc., has increased its prestige, with major universities competing to get prominent writers into their faculties. In the Philippines, the stereotype of the writer as a bespectacled academic in a business suit or a polo barong is at least as valid as that of the writer as a scrappy bohemian. Publishers, the pioneering New Day, the now defunct Kalikasan, Anvil, Milflores, Bookmark, and Giraffe have done their share to make literature an attractive occupation. Even the university presses, with the UP Press taking the lead, now carry literary titles as a matter of course, which was not true even as late as the 70s. Media practitioners who are graduates from the same universities that produce the creative writers and who themselves may be poets or short story writers whenever they can steal the time for it cooperate by giving high profile media coverage to literary events like book launching, poetry readings, literature, conference, and literary awards. So some writers will continue to write in English, and Philippine literature in English will continue to enjoy the prestige it does today. Simply because English will remain the language of power as long as the US remains the world's sole superpower. As we have seen, the desire to gain admission into the world literature was a powerful motivation to keep writing in English, long before the economic policy of globalization. It is not likely to go away now. However, more and more writers will become bilingual simply because Filipino is now a truly a national language, the one language in which Filipinos in each of the country's 7,107 islands can communicate. That would be all. Thank you for listening.